this is one of my most exciting shows that I'm going to be showing all year, because I got two wonderful young men from the University of Illinois downstate, Champaign, Urbana. And I want to introduce you to our wonderful, wonderful guests. Our first one here on my left is Elan Karoll, who is the co-president, correct, of the Illini Public Affairs Committee at the university. Yes. Am I correct on that? And on my right here is Eitan, Troyansky. Mm-hmm. You have the hardest name here. And you're the Midwest Campus Liaison at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana. Right. And I want to welcome both my guests.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Welcome to Eitan. And I'll start with you, Elan. What does that mean, anti-Israel is the new anti-Semitism?
Well, first of all, thank you for having us today. It's great to be able to have this discussion about anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity on college campuses. Both Eitan and I face this on a daily basis, and it's great that we're able to give a voice to it. We see so often on our college campus that anti-Israel activities and language is crossing the line into anti-Semitism, and criticism of the Jewish state turns into criticism of the Jewish people. And this takes a lot of forms. One form that we faced last semester on campus was something called the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign, known as BDS, which is essentially an effort by students on campus to pull all of the university's connections to Israel, including financial connections to Israel. And we believe that such efforts on campus are only efforts to isolate the Jewish community and to delegitimize the only Jewish country in the world, that is the State of Israel. And fortunately, we were able to successfully defeat the BDS campaign on our campus last year at the University of Illinois. So that is one example of how anti-Israel activities are becoming anti-Semitism.
What has been going on at your university as far as anti-Semitism? Maybe you could describe something that's been going on. I know we just went through Charlottesville just within a week ago, and maybe you could describe, I mean, are people marching there? I mean, are you getting neo-Nazis? Are you getting other groups that are, what exactly is going on at your university?
Great.
And other campuses?
Well,
you could chime in on
great question. We see anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activity manifest in a lot of forms on our campus. A lot of them can be, as we mentioned, the BDS boycott movement is one of the forms. We have a lot of anti-Israel speakers who come to campus, and even professors on college campuses who profess very anti-Israel views. We have marches, protests, rallies against Israel. We've seen Israeli flags covered with blood and covered with fake blood and burned, and all kinds of demonstrations against the Jewish community. So you brought up Charlottesville. I mean, some of the things they were chanting in Charlottesville, that the neo-Nazis were saying, things like the Jews will not replace us and the Zionists will not control our country. These are things that we are familiar with at our own university, and things that have been chalked on our quad and have been repeated at rallies. And even though the American public was super shocked by it, and what happened in Charlottesville, to us, it's almost normal, which is really sad.
Right. So, like you mentioned, in Charlottesville, the Confederate statues being a front for then protesting and being very racist and being very discriminatory. It's the same way with anti-Israel rhetoric on campus. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often used and manipulated, really, to be kind of used as a front for actual anti-Semitism, for demonizing the Jewish state of Israel, claiming it doesn't have the right to exist. And that's where you're crossing the line from legitimate criticism of Israel, criticism of policies or of governmental, anything, policy or law, to saying the whole state of Israel is bad, the state of Israel doesn't have the right to exist. That's where you cross the line into demonizing, delegitimizing.
How do you, Elan, how do when you say, when you go with working with students, and a student's getting bullied, or a professor at school is not, says something in their classroom, oh, Israel is an apartheid nation, and he's actually, say, a history professor. What do you do? How do you handle things like this?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do at Illini Public Affairs Committee is that we've been on the front lines of facing anti-Semitism and anti-Israel activities since our founding in 1984. And when students come to us, and it's very common, unfortunately, telling us that their professors are having them read anti-Israel books or read essays that criticize Israel or even write things that criticize Israel, we go to the administration and we go to our Jewish community leaders on campus, which we have really strong relationships with, and we're able to go through these channels and challenge these things and say, this is why it's unacceptable to have students do this, and we should be offering a more balanced curriculum to students. And even outside of the classroom, there are many experiences students have which feel like discriminated against them as Jewish people. And so it's our job as student leaders on campus, as pro-Israel student leaders, to stand up for these students who maybe don't know how to stand up for themselves. So we offer us as a resource to them.
Give me an example of how, either one of you, how you stand up for a student.
The important thing is really being there for students, especially the students who aren't necessarily as active in Jewish life and Israel education on campus. They're not used to this rhetoric, and they don't necessarily know how to react to it.
Yeah, because they say they came from, they came out of the northern suburbs of Chicago, and they had no idea. They've never heard anti-Semitism remarks. This is the first time they've heard something, and should they say something just on the spot? What should they do right on the spot?
The first thing to do is remain calm and to not reply to them. Oftentimes, these people are just agitators who are looking for the students to respond to them with even more anger, and that would only fuel the fire. So we tell people, be calm, even though it's obviously a difficult situation. And the next thing is look for help. So thankfully, we have a very strong Jewish community at the University of Illinois, and most colleges across the country have Hillels and Chabads, which are able to help them, and pro-Israel organizations which can be resources to them. And we tell them, tell us about what happened, and then we can go to the right authorities to deal with the situation. Sometimes it could be going to the administration and saying, a student group was perpetuating this anti-Semitism, we need to have consequences for the student group. Sometimes it's individual students who we need to deal with through other means. Sometimes we need to get law enforcement involved. Whatever it is, students should know that there's an entire community available to them to support them, and they're not alone. And even if it sometimes can feel very isolating, they should know that their experience isn't unique. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism is on the rise in our country like it hasn't been in a long time. And we see this really played out on college campuses with anti-Israel and anti-Semitism.
What do you think? Why do you think it's on the rise? What has made it on the rise? What do you think about that?
I think the normalization of this anti-Israel rhetoric that is actually demonizing the Jewish people has caused anti-Semitism to rise. When it's normalized that you can say whatever you want about the Jewish state and you can say they don't have the right to exist, then that's encouraging and enabling people to be anti-Semitic openly.
And I think I mentioned earlier, you need to get some Palestinians working with the BDS movement, with the Israeli students there, to show other people that this is not the right way to go.
Yeah, and I think you actually bring up a great point that I want to mention, is the fact that this actually really shows the true purpose of the BDS movement. The true purpose of the BDS movement is not, as it's tried to be described or advertised, as helping the Palestinian people. That's another front. The true purpose of the BDS movement is to alienate Jewish students on campus and try to silence their voices.
Well, one thing we always try to do on campus, and especially with Illini Public Affairs Committee, is we show people the truth about what's actually happening with these movements. And so when we had a BDS campaign on our campus last semester, one of the ways we went about defeating it was doing a lot of education about the student body, about the true efforts of BDS, and that divestment is meant to cause division. And that divestment is not actually a human rights campaign, but actually something that's meant to further marginalize the Jewish community. And through that education, we found our message very effective, and we were able to end up winning the vote. The vote was the most voted on item in 150 years of the University of Illinois' history. And we were able to get such a large turnout because we were able to educate people that they were being fooled by the BDS movement and that this is not the way to peace. And if they truly believe in bringing people together and bringing our campus community together, then they need to be voting no. And we were successful in that effort.
That's wonderful. How do you do that? How do you finally get people to listen to you? You know, because they hear the opposite rhetoric all the time. How do you get them to hear what you have to say? Either one of you.
Well, one thing that we find very effective is telling personal stories. So like you touched on with the fact that with SodaStream, that was one example of a company that was targeted by BDS. And so telling personal stories of Palestinians who've suffered under BDS is one way to do so. But in general, on campus, when we're advocating for Israel and for the U.S. Israel relationship, we talk about personal stories and how people's own lives are improved by Israel and our relationship with Israel. And that's really the best way to get into students' heads. And I think when you really are able to make those personal relationships, people will open up. And even though the media will like to say one thing, if they know you and you tell them that this is a really important issue to you, they'll be more receptive to those pro-Israel messages.
Education is the most important thing. Education is the route to peace. And by educating people about what's truly happening on the ground, we can further the peace process. You know, we were talking about earlier about how it's very easy to paint it as just two sides, but not think about it as individuals. Elan mentioned personal stories, right?
Yes.
Personal stories are extremely important because it really makes you seem like it's not an us versus them, right? It's, this is my story. This is why this is important to me. I'd like to show you why it is important to me. So really not showing it as like an us versus them, but showing it as this is a personal thing that a lot of people go through, I think is very important.
Tell me, how did you get involved in this movement and in Stand With Us? We'll start with you.
Go ahead.
Elan?
Sure. So I got involved with the pro-Israel community when I was entering high school. I was on several trips to Israel, and specifically I was there in 2014 during the conflict with Gaza during the summer, and I was realizing that I was no longer able to be a passive observer to what was happening there, and that the Israeli people are under constant threat of attack, and that when I was going to go back to the U.S., I could not sit silent about it. So I became involved in high school, and then going into college, I joined the Illini Public Affairs Committee and became involved there, and now I'm serving as co-president of the organization. So it's been a path through education and training that I've been here, and my job now as co-president is to raise up the new generation of young pro-Israel advocates and teach them how to spread our message to even more people.
And the same thing with you, Eitan.
Yeah.
How did you get involved into the movement?
So my story actually starts a lot longer before I was born. It starts back in the 1960s in the former Soviet Union. So my parents were born in Ukraine. Growing up Jewish there, they weren't religious, but they were culturally Jewish, and they were constantly bullied by their peers, and they were constantly facing true anti-Semitism just for being Jewish. They moved from the Soviet Union to Israel, where I was born. Then they ended up relocating to the United States. And having grown up here my whole life, I never thought I would experience the same anti-Semitism that they did. You know, I grew up in Buffalo Grove, a northwest suburb, surrounded by a pretty good Jewish population. So I never thought I would actually experience true anti-Semitism until I got to a college campus. And when I got to campus, I realized that anti-Semitism was actually very alive and very well through the anti-Israel movement.
What happened to you? What was your experience of anti-Semitism?
Well, it was really just the fact that I saw the activity of anti-Israel groups on campus. It wasn't any one particular instance. It was just that I never experienced anti-Israel or anti-Semitism before, and I did when I got to campus. So I got involved with Jewish organizations, with pro-Israel organizations, and I tried to find as many ways to help as I could.
Elan?
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being here, and Eitan, it was a
much for having us.
pleasure having both of you here today and explaining to our viewers about anti-Israel is a new anti-Semitism, because a lot of people don't realize that anti-Israel is also about anti-Semitism,
Right.
and it's something that nobody talks about. It's kind of hidden, and I thought that this was, this was a very good thing that our viewers need to know, and I highly recommend you guys got to get on other networks besides myself, my show, and just spread the word around, because I think it's so important that people hear what you guys have to say. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.